Lots of professional gamers keep using the Logitech G Pro X Superlight, and lots of people are still buying it, even though this mouse was released way back in 2020. And yeah, I guess you can't really blame them, because this is not a bad mouse. It's actually a pretty good mouse. But honestly, there are so much more interesting mice these days, some of which are a good bit lighter than Logitech's offering, straight up better for claw grip, or at the very least offer a similar level of performance for way less money. So I tested some of the most popular wireless gaming mice and want to give you my thoughts and opinions about which of these are actually worth picking up. Now, the Endgame Gear XM2V is one of those mice that shows you just how important the shape of the mouse actually is. Like, spec-wise, this mouse really isn't anything special, and certainly not any better than the good old G Pro X Superlight. At 62 grams, it weighs basically the same as the Superlight, and it only comes with a 3370 sensor, which also doesn't support motion sync. But the shape is just one of the best mouse shapes on the market, in my opinion. It felt super natural to me right from the first second, like no need to readjust the grip or anything. For reference, my hands are 18 by 10 centimeters, which is fairly average for a male adult. And I usually play claw grip, and this is the grip style this mouse shape really works best with. See, there's this pretty large hump at the rear of the mouse, which you can really press your lower palm into and get a very secure grip. The hump of the GPX Superlight, in comparison, is much more centered, which leaves less room for a proper claw grip, and almost kind of forces a light palm grip. Also, the sides of the Superlight are basically flat, with almost no grooves, whereas the XM2V has a super strong hourglass-like shape. And I find this really helps with micro-adjusting, as I can get a much better grip with my thumb. This mouse right here is a great alternative to the XM2V, with a very similar shape but better internals. It's the Atlantis by Lamzu, which is a fairly new mouse brand, but they already had quite the impact with the Atlantis. The shape is extremely similar to the XM2V, so it's just as great for claw grip. But it's about 11% lighter and comes with a PixArt 3395, which is the newer and better sensor. But both of these mice come in at about $90, so the Atlantis is the better value mouse, at least on paper. Now, a 7 grams weight difference doesn't sound like much, and yeah, it's definitely not a night and day difference. But this is actually kinda noticeable in game. The newer sensor though, I want to touch on sensor differences in a minute or so, but the differences are definitely more subtle. The different coatings though have a very noticeable impact, and the XM2V really has the grippier coating. It's a much more rubberized surface and honestly sticks like crazy. It's also a fingerprint magnet, but I guess that's a worthy trade-off for a good grip. The better coating of the XM2V is the main reason why I prefer this over the Atlantis, even though the Atlantis is technically superior. My unit of the Atlantis also has an issue with the right mouse button. I talked to Lamzu and they told me they went a bit too tight with the tolerances, causing some units to make this squeaking noise. But moving forward, they want to leave a bit more room to make sure that this doesn't happen anymore. Other than the noisy right click, I really don't have anything bad to say about the build quality of the Atlantis. Without the squeaking noise and with a better coating, I'd probably pick this over the Endgame Gear XM2V. Now, from the side, you could easily mistake this mouse for yet another Atlantis / XM2V lookalike. Yeah, it has essentially the same side profile, but the Pulsar X2 actually has a very different shape on the sides, which makes it feel different in hand. Instead of the hourglass-like shape, Pulsar went with a much less curved design that more resembles the flat sides of the G Pro Superlight. I guess you could say this makes the X2 kinda like a claw grip version of the G Pro X Superlight. For better claw grip experience, you have the hump shifted towards the back and a much lower trigger placement, but you maintain the flat side shape of the Superlight. I can see why a lot of people really love the X2 for that, especially if you're coming from a G Pro model, but I personally prefer the hourglass shape of the XM2 or the Atlantis. Though Pulsar managed to combine some of the best properties of the Atlantis and the XM2V into their mouse. This is the new premium black version of the X2, which has a very similar rubberized coating to the XM2V, which is one of the best mouse coatings I've ever tested. And the X2 also weighs just 56 grams and has the newer 3395 sensor, just like the Atlantis. So if it wasn't for the flat side shape, the Pulsar X2 Premium Black would be my favorite of these three mice. But this goes to show that the shape of the mouse really is the most important factor. And I actually learned this the hard way some time ago when I bought the Razer Viper V2 Pro. So, as you probably have guessed, the Viper V2 Pro is not a mouse I can recommend to most people. But the Viper and these two are all very popular mice, and I have, let's say, mixed feelings about them, so I want to talk about why that is. Okay, let's start with the Viper V2 Pro and the Asus ROG Harpe Ace. From a technical standpoint, these both are very impressive mice. Both are in the mid to high 50 grams range, without any cutouts, both have flagship level sensors that support motion sync, and both Razer and Asus did an excellent job with the sensor and wireless implementation. The Viper even supports 4 kHz polling when you buy Razer's overpriced dongle. So yeah, very impressive specs, and I have to admit that it was the impressive spec sheet of the Viper V2 Pro that kinda tricked me into buying a mouse that probably made me aim worse than with my old mouse. So yeah, for me, these two mice are some of the most uncomfortable mice I've ever tested. I just can't get a good grip on them, which has a huge negative impact on my aim. Partly that's because of the coating. Both mice have a very similar, hard plastic-like coating that really doesn't provide a good grip. And then there's the shape. The shapes of these two mice are obviously very different. The Viper is a rather flat mouse, probably best suited for palm or fingertip grip, though for fingertip grip you need to have rather large hands, as this mouse is pretty long. And the Harpe Ace is probably best described as an uncreative take at the G Pro Superlight shape, slightly longer with the hump shifted a few millimeters towards the back. I feel like with both these mice, Razer and Asus were a bit too focused on getting the technical aspects, like the sensor, weight, latency and that kind of stuff right, and didn't put enough thought into how these mice actually feel in hand. I guess you could say it's the complete other extreme with this mouse. The shape is great, but the technical specs really are not. This is the Zowie EC3CW, and the specs would have been kinda decent for a flagship mouse like at least 2 years ago. But I have no idea how Zowie came to think that selling a 76 grams mouse with a 3370 sensor for about $150 can be justified in 2023. I mean, yeah, Zowie mice still have an almost cult-like following, so I guess they have no issue finding at least a few people that will happily pay the $150 for this. But I find it hard to believe that Zowie wouldn't have been able to put a 3395 sensor into this mouse, made it lighter, or even implement 4 kHz polling, and still sell it for about the same price. Zowie argue that you don't need all of that, and that you're not going to be able to tell the 3370 and 3395 apart in-game anyways. And yeah, that's kinda true, but then why not make this a sub $100 mouse? Then my take on this mouse would have been certainly far more positive, because this really isn't a bad mouse. It's a really nice, small ergo shape that works great for claw grip and small to medium sized hands. The coating can easily compete with Logitech's, and my grip really feels dialed in with this mouse. Though I have to say that the weight is noticeable. Like 76 grams don't sound like too much, but compared to all the other 50 grams plus something mice, it honestly feels heavy like a brick. For tech shooters like Valorant, the weight is kinda acceptable, as you don't really have to make a lot of fast and large mouse movements, but for Overwatch, this mouse just feels so much worse than the other mice, just because of the weight. So yeah, in my opinion, the EC3CW and all the other mice of the EC series are like very niche. Really only recommended for people that have been using Zowie mice before and want the exact same experience, but wireless. Now, when you compare this mouse to the Zowie EC3CW, it really makes you question the sanity over the mouse market. Like on one side we have the mouse that weighs 76 grams and comes equipped with the slightly dated 3370 sensor, and on the other side we have a 58 grams mouse with the 3395, which is one of the latest and greatest sensors. Yet, the technically more advanced Darmoshark M3 comes in for less than $50, which is a fraction of what the Zowie mouse cost. So let's talk about sensors for a bit. Does a higher end sensor actually make a difference? On paper, the PixArt 3395 clearly is the better sensor, and it does support motion sync, which definitely is a nice feature. Like when you see graphs like this with motion sync off versus motion sync on, it's hard to argue that the 3395 isn't technically superior than the 3370 that doesn't support motion sync. You can really see how much more consistent and cleaner the sensor data with motion sync actually is. But that being said, I have to admit that I don't really feel the difference between a good 3370 implementation or a flagship 3395 sensor when actually gaming. Now despite that, I still like to see manufacturers using the latest and greatest sensors. And even if you can't easily sense it in game, the data shows that the 3395 is technically the better sensor. And thus, I think this is what most manufacturers should be using for their flagship products. So kudos to Darmoshark for actually putting a 3395 sensor into this sub $50 mouse. I don't know how they're able to pull this off, but the Darmoshark M3 has seriously impressive specs for its price. And this is a 57 to 58 grams mouse with a completely solid shell. So you might be thinking that the implementation of the sensor or wireless tech might be lacking at this price point. But this really is not the case. There's no perceivable latency, and the M3 works just as good as the more expensive 3395 equipped mice. Though I have to say that the shape and the coding could use some work. The shape reminds me of a mix between the G Pro Superlight and the Viper V2 Pro. Feels like Darmoshark just took the average of these two mouse shapes and then made it slightly larger. It's not a bad shape by any means, though it's certainly not the best shape for claw grip, and not ideal for smaller or medium-sized hands. But there will be a smaller variant soon, the M3S Varun, that looks like it has a much better shape for claw grip, so I'm excited to see how that turns out. My shape preferences aside, this is just insane value for money. Sure, there are some things that could be improved, like the coating could be grippier, and the stock skates are just terribly scratchy out of the box. They break in over time and become kinda usable, but a better skates design with rounded edges would improve the experience a ton. But yeah, this is a sub $50 mouse with a great sensor and a weight in the mid 50s, so I really don't want to be too critical. Now I just mentioned that the wireless implementation of this rather cheap mouse is just as flawless as with the other much more expensive mice. So let's actually talk about the wireless latency for a bit. Luckily I have an Nvidia LDAT sensor, so I can actually measure the latency between the mouse click and something being displayed on the monitor. I'm using the 360Hz Zowie XL2566K for this test, which is a pretty fast monitor which helps keeping the other leg components as low as possible. Okay, let's take a look at the results. It's really no surprise that Razer and Logitech are high up on the chart. Like, both Razer and Logitech are getting a lot of praise for their flawless wireless implementations, and these numbers back that up. But honestly, if we ignore those dark blue bars for a bit, there really isn't a huge difference between all of these results. The slowest mouse is just 5 milliseconds slower than the fastest, which really isn't a huge difference. The dark blue graphs are a bit more interesting though. These are the latency numbers for the default debounce setting. And for some reason, both Lamzu and Ninjutso chose a super long 12 millisecond debounce setting as a default, which really adds a lot of unnecessary lag. Fortunately though, every mouse I tested works totally fine with the 0 millisecond debounce setting without any double clicking issues. So I definitely recommend changing the debounce setting if there's an option. All the mice that don't have a debounce option in their driver were fine out of the box, by the way. So when it comes to the latency, we really only should look at the light blue bars here, as this is the way you should be using all of these mice. And these are also the settings that I've been using personally. And yeah, for what it's worth, the latency with all of these mice with these settings feels completely identical to me. For me, there's certainly no perceivable difference between the 50 milliseconds Zowie and the 10 milliseconds Razer mouse, or all the other mice in between on this chart. So yeah, from that standpoint, all the mice in this video are great. But this mouse right here actually is my personal favorite of all the mice I've tested so far. It's the Sora by Ninjutso, and it really ticks all the right boxes for me. The shape falls into the same category as the Endgame Gear XM2V and the Lamzu Atlantis. But the Sora is slightly shorter and not as wide. Size-wise, it's almost right in between the regular Atlantis and the mini version, and shape-wise, it's a bit closer to what Endgame gear are doing. But the shape of the Sora is also somewhat unique. The trigger height, for instance, is a good bit lower, which is great for even more aggressive claw grip. Really a great shape, and the slightly smaller size makes the Sora feel like super nimble. It's also quite a bit lighter than the others, as it weighs just 47 to 48 grams, which Doesn't sound like a huge weight reduction, but this actually is super noticeable. Like going from the Sora to the Atlantis, there's a weight increase of about 16%. And from the Sora to the XM2V, it's a whopping 30% weight increase. That's really noticeable when you make fast movements or lift up the mouse to reset. I'm honestly amazed how Ninjutso can pull this off with a completely solid shell and bottom plate. Both the Lamzu Atlantis and the Pulsar X2, which both are mid 50 grams mice, only achieve their weight with quite a few cutouts in the bottom plate. It's also pretty impressive that this still is a sub $100 mouse. It's also equipped with a 3395 sensor, so Ninjutso didn't cut any corners there, and the Wano black shell pink dot implementation is one of the best I've tried so far. The clicks are spammable but not too light, and have a very nice and crisp click feel with virtually no post travel. One thing Ninjutso could improve though is the coating. Like, it's by no means a bad coating, but it's not as good as the super sticky coating on the XM2V or the coating on the premium black edition of the Pulsar X2. It's more on par with what Logitech are using on the G Pro Superlight, which is a good coating already, but if Ninjutso could find out which coating Endgame gear and Pulsar are using and put that on the Sora, that would be insane. But yeah, even with this coating, for me the Sora takes the #1 spot, followed by the XM2V and the Lamzu Atlantis. Of course, I have all the mice linked down below, as well as the mousepads I've been using during my testing. Thanks for watching, bis zum nächsten Video.